Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Let me first thank the University of Geneva and the Geneva Water Hub for inviting me here. Basically, the title of my talk today is to basically explore water governance through a series of 4 keywords. Basically, rivers, walls, scarcities, and individuals. You're probably going to notice one unexpected word in this series of words, which is probably the last one, individuals. Most of the aspects of water governance has essentially been framed around issues of rivers, walls, and scarcity. So let me start with a little anecdote. Basically, I live in Brighton and I often take the train to go to London. And because I'm an academic, I'm quite curious and talk to other people. And basically, they'll start asking me, what do I work on? And I say that I work on water. And one of the most recurrent responses is, oh, how interesting. Water will be the next walls of the next century. And basically, we still got this image of water walls that's so much omnipresent in our minds. You can just turn to the sort of recent news of the debates between Ethiopia and Egypt over the Nile River and the construction of a large river, of a large dam, basically, in Ethiopia. And these sort of spectrums of walls as sort of exemplified in this image that you can see here on the screen. However, the evidence points to a really different reality. What we can see are essentially walls of words rather than real walls. Whether it's in the Nile Basin or in the Jordan River Valley. And if you look at the sort of scholarly evidence, one can see more of a history of cooperation rather than a history of conflict. Of course, I don't want to emphasize that everything is jolly and everything is working well. It took more than 30 years to negotiate the 1997 UN Convention on the law of the non-negotiable use of international watercourses. And if you look more precisely at some of the regional agreements, something like 145 of them in different river basins, we can see that nearly half of them don't have any monitoring mechanisms. 2/3 don't really look at specific allocations. So when you think of water, that could be very problematic. And 4/5 of them don't have enforcement mechanisms. So we're talking about very limited forms of cooperation at the same time, but we're not talking about water walls. So how can we explain that we still got this image of water walls that is still going on and is blocked in our mindset in some ways? Well, I just did a little exercise. I went on the Economist and basically looked at their water page, and basically randomly took all their titles and then I just produced a word cloud. And what's quite interesting is that you can see some of the keywords standing out, and one of them is clearly sort of crisis. You got so much of this image of water crisis that seems to persist. Quite interestingly, scarcity there is quite small, surprisingly. But as I said, I took a very scientific random method, and that's what's being produced. You got other sort of alarmist words around dryness, around dry, around drought, around desperate, and so on. Not to talk about the so-called threat, in brackets, of emerging powers like China. That seems to be an obsession of newspapers recently. That's a series of images. There I had to select a few that were associated on the Economist page with some of these narratives. And it's quite interesting. Obviously, again, very alarmist pictures, whether about dry, about pollution, about also the use of statistics. That's quite interesting, and one has to be careful about the number of assumptions that are, first of all, behind sort of these graphs, but also the sort of policy recommendations one could derive from these graphs. And in some ways, you can see that the sort of global scarcity narratives that are so influential in keeping these mindsets around water wars are leading to new types of solutions, like the nexus, which is basically trying to understand towards a better understanding of the relationship between food, water, and energy. And obviously, these are a response to the different food and energy and financial crises that have emerged. And basically leads ourselves to ask a number of questions. To what extent, really, these solutions are really there to sort of enhance local people's well-being? Or are these processes, sort of very top-down processes, allowing new actors to increase processes of enclosures and common? Very much linked to land and water and green grabs debates that are going on. Of course, there's not just one framing. I've talked about the nexus, but you've got several different framings. This is a table that tries to summarize the most predominant ones. Basically, you got essentially a sort of rights framing. You got another one which is more linked to sort of water and energy, which is much more of a sort of nexus framing. And then finally, you got one which is much more linked to sort of climate change and ecosystems, which have all different sort of aspects in terms of policy instruments and normative frameworks behind them. I'm not going to go into detail in all of them, but I just wanted to illustrate the different approaches that are being put forward right now in the global arena. And I think the main point I really wanted to make today in terms of water governance is that future water security debates basically need to move away from environmental determinism and scarcity debates towards social equality and equity and responsibility debates, very much in relationship to notions of human security and in some ways biocentric security, meaning basically within the sort of planetary boundaries aspects. And one aspect I think that is really important in terms of development now is this whole idea of also water footprinting. Basically, to what extent this is sort of shaping sort of consumer behavior and perhaps rising to a certain new consciousness. And basically what happens in some ways is that water security is slowly shifting. At least that's part of my argument. It's slowly shifting towards the individual level, and it's becoming individualized. But it's becoming individualized in two ways, and one has to be careful about it, because there's a struggle at this individual level. On the one hand, you got a notion very much linked to individualism, which is there very much linked to ideas of consumer preferences as an agent in determining the water security of others. And this is very much opposed to another notion, which is very much this idea of individual well-being, which is there much more linked to these ideas of human security concerns, linked to issues of access, right, equality, and sustainability. So as a last word, because we are in a critical period right now in defining the new 2015 Sustainable Development Goals, one has to be careful in this needs balance between the individual and the community and the commons. And one has to probably learn from history and shift away from sort of what I call dangerous neoliberal individualist agenda, which market forces, behavioralist interpretations of choice, and the consumer king will sway over issues of equity, cooperation, and common futures. And I think the way forward, basically, to end this water governance talk is really about thinking about protecting the rights and duties of individuals, while at the same time mitigating the potential negative externalities of individual consumer preferences. Thank you very much.